All right, good morning, good afternoon, good day to everyone. Welcome to DBA Fundamentals, the presentation for April 13th, 2021. We'll be talking about packaging permissions in stored procedures with the great Erland. And today, let's see, we have for DBA Fundamentals, we have our normal cast of crew. Steve, Shane, and myself, Kevin Wookie. If you have any need to get a hold of us, you can always reach out to us on Twitter. You see in the top right corner of the screen our Twitter handles. You can also reach out to DBA Fundamentals in various fashions. First off would be our meetup group. You can reach out to us also on our webpage, dbafun.org. Or you can see any of our past presentations on dbafundtube.com. Or you can reach out to us on Twitter at dbafun, our Slack channel, or our LinkedIn group, where we do lots of talking about all kinds of things on any of those various social media platforms. So if you have anything, just reach out to us on any of your favorite ones. The session will be recorded today and will probably be available within the next 1 to 2 days. You can always find it on dbafuntube.com, as I mentioned earlier, or on our webpage where you can see all of our past presentations. And with that, we go to Erland. Here is his bio if you'd like to see it. But with that, I give you the man, the myth, the legend. Here you go.
Okay, thank you. So I realized I need to start this presentation by leaving the table because I really should have a glass of water by the side of me just in case I need to clear it off out, and I've forgotten that. So I will be back in just a few seconds.
You're fine. I'm sure we can always talk amongst ourselves. It's all good.
I will be raising my first pub-based pint on Saturday. Full stop.
That does sound good.
So, then I'm going to try and... So, I hope everyone sees the screen.
Yes.
Yeah, because it worked a few minutes ago, so it should work now. So, welcome to this presentation entitled Packaging Permissions and Stored Procedures. This is one of my favorite topics. And, we have already, there was a title, a barrier slide there, so I'm just going to do this quickly. My name is Alan Sommerskog, and I live in Stockholm, where I work as independent consultant. I've been an MVP for SQL Server for many, many years. And I have this website, sommerskog.sc, which you can say is a small collection of large articles. And one of these articles is called Packaging Permissions in Stored Procedures. And this presentation is, it's kind of a teaser for that article. That article, I rewrote it a couple of years ago, and I put some stuff in the appendix, and I thought now it would be shorter. Turned out it had grown in 60% of length, although I did not really add much material. So I'm explaining things slower. But this is kind of a compacted version of that article. So lots of details I'm not entailing in it. This is, some details, but there's also some things you can use this on higher level. Anyway, my email address is here, sql@sommerskog.sc. So if there are any questions, I will pause at a few places to stop for questions. But if there is something that comes to you afterwards, just feel free to drop me a line. I'd like to point out that the slides and all scripts you see are already available on my website at sommerskog.se/present. So you can just go there. You don't have to take photos of the stuff you see. You can just get the goods afterwards. So what is this all about? Well, let's say this. You have a user, and you want that user to be able to perform a specific action that requires the permission X. That could be anything from just being select on a table to be, sysadmin. However, you don't want to grant that user the permission directly, because then the user will be able to do a lot more. Maybe he should need select on that table only to see, the rows for his own department, for example. Or yes, he needs to be sysadmin because he should be able to do, some very special thing, but he should not be able to do everything. Now, would it then be great if you could package that permission with that specific action inside a stored procedure with full control of what the user can do? Now, someone might think, wait a minute, isn't that the way it works? No. Now, there is one situation where this works, a special but very common case, and we will look at that as well. But what we're going to work with today is how we can do it in all the other cases. It uses some techniques. So here is my agenda. I will start to talk about ownership chaining, which is that very common special case. I will talk about certificate signing, which we can use both on database or both on database and server level, how we can use that when ownership chaining is not enough to package permissions. I will also talk about the execute as clause, which is an alternative way. In my opinion, I don't like it so much, but I will talk about that one as well, both on database and server level, and that will lead us to the dangers of making a database trustworthy. And then at the end, I will just very briefly discuss how we can do this for cross-database access. So, ownership chaining, this is something which has been in the product, I guess, since 1.0. I don't know, because I started using SQL Server with, I think it was 4.0.2. But the way it works is this. You have a procedure, or it could be a view, or a function, or a trigger, that accesses some kind of object. And these two objects have the same owner. There is no permission check at all in the case of plain DML, like select, insert, update, delete, and merge, or when you invoke others, the procedures or functions. However, ownership chaining does not apply if the access is through dynamic SQL. It does not apply if you're trying to access metadata about the object. And nor does it apply if you need special permissions such as alter. So let's have a look at this. And we're going to start to set up a demo database for today. So I'm going to start with creating a database called PermTest. And I will make SA the owner of PermTest. I like to point out from the beginning, this is not a good practice in my opinion, and I will return to why. However, for now, SA will own this database. The next thing I will do is I will create the test login, a test user, with the password obladi oblada. Then I will move over to PermTest and make test user user of PermTest, and also I will also create a role called rock and roll and make test user a member of rock and roll. The next thing I will do is I will create a view token info that we will use for diagnostic purposes. It retrieves 3 columns from this DB called sys.user token, and also the result of 3 system functions, original login, system user, and user. And exactly what this is, I will return to when we actually see the data. Next thing I will do is I will create a table called perm table, which has an ID, a title, and also an auditing column entered by, which defaults to the database user. And here I'm already directly inserting one row in that table with the title Strawberry Fields Forever. Then I will create a test procedure with, well, it takes an ID and a title as a parameter, and it will return data from the token info, so we can see the tokens that are in play. It inserts these ID and the title into the table, and also then returns all rows in the perm table. And I will give rock and roll permission to run test SP. So now we have set things up, and it sounds like someone needs to mute. I think I hear sound, so if you could please check that you're muted, that would help. What I'm going to do now, I don't have to log in as test user, but what I will do is that I will impersonate the test user. This is a very handy way when you want to test permissions. You don't have to log in, but you can do this in your own query window. So I do say execute as test user, and down here to revert, I am test user. Now, you may notice here that I've got go here. This is not needed syntactically or anything, but I recommend when you do this, always put revert in a batch of its own, because if this batch fails for some reason, well, then this revert may not be executed, and you will remain test user or whatever you're testing with. And this can cause quite a bit of confusion. I know, been there, done that. So, test user now tries this to, and it runs test SP to enter fixing a hole. And you can now see, well, test user was able to enter fixing a hole. Now, remember this, test user does not have any permissions on perm table. No one has any permission on perm table. But rock and roll has permission to run test SP. And now let's look at what this token info returns. So it returns token name. So those are 3 security tokens. So this is test user, the user itself, and the role public, and the role rock and roll, the two roles that test user is a member of. And then, well, this is also what type of token this is. And then we have the usage, grant or deny. So these tokens are good for both grant and deny. We can also see original login. So that was the person who actually logged into SQL Server. And that is me, present 10 / solar. That's me. And then we can see what is the current user on server level and database. And that is test user. So now, what am I going to do now? So in most databases, everything is owned by DBAs. You might not even think of this, but it is possible to have different owner. And I'm going to do this. So I'm going to create a user for this. And because I'm only going to have a user, I don't want to create a login. So I'm going to say create user, different user without login. This is also very handy if you want to test things inside the database. Just create something without login, and you don't have to create the login with all passwords and all that. And then I will make different owner of perm table. And now test user tries to run test SP again to enter main Mr. Mustard. Let's see how that works. No, it does not. We get if the insert permission was denied, the select permission was denied. Because now the owners are different and there is a permission check and test user or no one has permission to do anything on perm table. But as I said, it's very uncommon to have different owners, and I'm going to restore DBO as owner of perm table. And test user now tries to again enter meet Mr. Mustard, and now it was entered. Now, I'm going to change the test SP to try different things. So here is one with a dynamic part. So here is some dynamic SQL, some bad dynamic SQL. If you know anything about SQL injection, you can see that this one is wide open to SQL injection. Someone could enter here a title with, well, that starts with a single quote, some SQL command, and then 2 hyphens to kill the single quote that was intended to be there. So I will try to run this. We create this guy. And then test user tries to enter now love me do. But there is an error message. The select permission was denied on the object perm table. Nevertheless, love me do was entered, so it's only the dynamic part that fails. So why does not ownership chaining work here? Well, there's kind of 2 reasons for that. One, purely technical. This is not part of test SP. This is a different store procedure. It's named as the procedure, and it doesn't have an owner, or maybe test user is the owner of it. But whatever, ownership chaining does not apply. And that is a good thing, because if ownership chaining had applied, well, then test user could have entered single quote, delete some other table, and 2 hyphens, and, well, he could have gotten away with it, because if ownership chaining had applied, he could do anything that DBO could do. That's bad. But they were smart enough to not permit ownership chaining in this case. Now, here's a new variation. I'm adding a new parameter called reset. And if this one is 1, I'm going to say, okay, just clear the table and before we enter the new row. And I'm going to do that with truncate table, because that is more efficient than just saying delete. So test user now tries to enter Martham ID and also clear the table. But it does not work out. Cannot find the object perm table because it does not exist, or you do not have permissions. And it happens on line 5. And we can see that line 5 in test SP is, well, let's see, we should, of course, do that. That's, oh yeah, we should have trust management studio. Anyway, it is this line truncate table, because truncate table requires alter permission. And you don't get that through ownership chaining. In this case, for this to run, test user needs to have alter table himself, or rock and roll would have need to have this permission. And here is one thing that really can trip you. So the situation is here that we have some deployment problems. So it may be that when the user is running this procedure, perm table may not have been created yet. And we don't want to splash an ugly error in the face of the user. So we make a check. Can we find this table? Does it exist? And if not, we print out no table today. So let's do that. And test user tries to run this and tries to enter the fool on the hill. And sure enough, it really feels like the fool on the hill, because it says no table today. And yet he knows, I was able to enter data into this table just a few seconds ago. What happened? Well, the story is this. To access metadata on an object, you need at least view definition. And if you have select permission, that is implied. But no ownership chaining applies here, so that's why it returns null. We would need to grant test user permissions on the perm table. So much about ownership chaining. Before I go on, so if there are any questions on this part,
Nope.
feel
No
free.
questions so far.
Okay, that's great. That was just, I put this on it since this is just the first section. So, ownership, we have looked at ownership chaining, but we've also seen that there are situations where ownership chaining doesn't work for us. So, now we want to do this. So we have certificate signing, and this is the main technique I think we should use in these situations. And I will start giving the recipe for just how to do this, and it will seem like a bit of mumbo jumbo first, but then before I discuss what it's all about. So the first step is this: you create a certificate. Next, you sign the procedure with that certificate. You create a user from the certificate, and then you grant the certificate user the permissions needed. And that could also be membership in a role. So far, the technique, the mechanics about it. But before we actually look at the commands, let's try to get some understanding of why this works and what it's all about. So, first of all, certificates and signatures. This is something which is not specific to SQL Server, but this is quite all over the place in the IT world. So a certificate, that is an asymmetric key that consists of three things. The first is a private key that you keep secret and protect with a password, keep it locked in a safe or whatever, but it's always your private key. Then there is a public key that you can share with anyone. And there is also some metadata, including a signature on the certificate itself. Now, for our purposes, self-signed certificates are perfectly sufficient, and we don't really care about that metadata, but we have to provide it. Now, the story is this. You can have, if you have a document, or it could be an email or whatever, you can sign this with your private key. The person who receives the document or mail, etc., can take your public key and verify the signature. And if the signature validates, the receiver can be quite sure that the document was from you and not someone else, and it has not been tampered or changed in transport. It is actually what you composed and said. Now, so what has this to do with SQL Server? So the way, if we sign to procedures, the way it works is this. So we invoke a sign to procedure. SQL Server checks, is the signature valid? And if it is, yep, is there a user tied to the certificate? Yep, there is. Right? Or let's say there is. Then the SQL Server will take this user and add it to sys.user token. And thus the permissions of that user will apply in sign to procedure. And this is not any kind of user. You might get nervous. I don't want to add extra users in my database. But it's a very special type of user or a database principle. You cannot log in or be as this user, nor can you impersonate it. Well, you could say it's a bit of a kludge, but it exists to connect the certificate with the permission, because granting permissions directly to the certificate is also somewhat creepy. And you can only create one user per certificate. So let's have a look at this. So I'm going to move to perm test, and here's the first step in the recipe: creating the certificate. Create certificate, democert, encryption my password. All you need is love, and with the subject, a certificate to demonstrate procedure signing. Now, as I said, a certificate has to be protected by something. In SQL Server, that can be a password, but it can also be, well, another certificate or the database master key. Now, for these signing things, a password is by far the most easiest thing, and I found it very creepy to involve the database master key, which they don't even have one. The subject, well, normal certificates have some kind of syntax with semicolons, etc., that I don't really know, but we can enter almost any text here. I say almost any text. Don't include a comma. I tried that, and I was very confused by the error message. But any free text like this works. So I created my certificate. Now I want to sign the procedure. Add signature to test SP by certificate democert with password. All you need is love, because I have to use the private key, and every time I'm accessing the private key, I need to provide the password. Before we move on, let's look at this query that returns all signed procedures in the database. So there is a catalog view called sys.crypt_properties, which holds all signatures in the database. And then I join that to certificates on the thumbprint. The thumbprint is what actually identifies the certificate. And I also join this to sys.objects and sys.schemas to get the name of the procedure. And I can run this query. And I get back that test_sp is signed by dimassert, and we can also see the subject. And here's the data from sys.crypto properties, the thumbprint of the certificate, or the blob, or binary data. And here's the signature itself, which is just exactly that, a blob. Now, let's create a user from that certificate. Create user, dimassert user from certificate dimassert. Now, just to show you here, if I try to create a second one, you can see I get an error message. So I can't do that. And the reason they have this restriction is it wouldn't make any sense to have multiple users. That would only be confusing. And then we can also look at this user here in sys principles, and we can see here that, well, it's a type C, certificate mapped user, and authentication type desk none, so it can't log in. So, and finally then, I'm going to grant this dimassert user select on perm table. Now, let's go back to our test_sp, and as a reminder, this is how it looks right now. We have this check, does perm table exist? And if not, we're going to print out no table today. So test user now tries to run this and enter across the universe. And yes, now this time the thing worked out, the table was there, he could enter across the universe. But let's now look at the tokens. Now there are 4 of them. There's only not test user, public, and rock and roll. There is also dimassert user, user mapped to certificate. And this guy has the permission select. And because the permissions is now a complete union of all the permissions from all these tokens, yes, dimassert user, test user can do the metadata check and find the table and therefore also access the data. Now, so we get some complaints from the user nevertheless that, yeah, it was good you put in that message, but no table today. Very confusing. People don't know about Herman Hermits and hits from 1966, so couldn't you put in something a little less cryptic? Oh yeah, so we give in and say, okay, we're going to change this to perm table has not been created yet. So we change the procedure, and test user now tries to enter, here comes the sun. And you might guess, if you've been paying attention, you might guess as this is going to end. Yeah, perm table has not been created yet. Because, as I told you, for the signature to be valid, that proves that what we signed is still the same. But at this point, we have changed the context, so the signature is no longer valid. As a matter of fact, SQL Server takes this one step further. It realizes that since we changed the procedure, we can just as well just drop the entire signature. It's because it's of no use anymore. So we need to sign the procedure again, add signature to test_sp by certificate dimassert with password. All you need is love. And test user tries again to enter. Here comes the sun. And now dimassert user is back here, and in the tokens, and this user can now insert. Here comes the sun. Now we're going to try see more things what we can do with this. So we're going to try again with this dynamic part. So we're going to create that version and also directly sign it. And test user now tries to run it to enter taxman. Last time we got an error message from the dynamic part, but this time we get that select in the dynamic part. We get back the title we inserted. So this tells us that if you look at the tokens, this guy is still precedences user token when we entered the dynamic SQL. And yes, there is still now an SQL injection hole, but observe this. The only thing the test user can abuse this to is to possibly access rows in perm table he should not be permitted to see. But he can't add rows to perm table with this. He can't insert rows because the only permission present on perm table is select on the table and no other permission. So the damage of the SQL injection hole has been really, really minimized. And it turns out that our test user has been kind of naughty recently, so we're going to actually deny him explicitly select, insert, update, delete on perm table. Because this is getting out of hand. We need to do that. So, and test user is not stopped by that. He's still going to try to enter the long and winding road. But now the dynamic part errors out. However, the long and winding road was still inserted because there is ownership chaining and no permission check at all. So it doesn't matter that test user has the 9 on the table. However, now if we look at the tokens, this guy contributes with select, but test user contributes with deny. And deny always takes precedence over select. So therefore deny wins, and therefore test user was not able. So this is the one thing you cannot solve with certificates if you have a deny in the mix. But deny is something you should use very, very sparingly because it can often get you into big trouble. Remember this, that when you start, users have very, very few permissions in the database. You have to grant them about anything. So I'm going to revoke that one and restore things. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to explore more how the powers of this, or how far the token, how long it remains in this user token, the token of the certificate user. So I'm going to create a trigger on the table, and all it does is to, well, return the name of the trigger and the data and token info. And the same thing for an inner store procedure. And then I'm going to recreate test SP again. So I'm first going to add a call to a system procedure to get some more metadata of my perm table. I'm going to call inner_sp, and I'm going to insert a row into perm table, which will fire the trigger. And before I assign it, I'm going to run this test user to enter revolution number 9. And, well, you can see here now that I got an error message from SP Help Index. So no ownership chaining applies here. To be able to run SP Help Index inside the procedure, test user needs, well, there needs to be permission present on perm table. But you can see that the rest of the code was executed and revolution number 9 was inserted. And you can see here there's, well, still 3 lines in user token. Now I'm going to assign this, and the test user now is going to run this enter helter skelter. And first of all, no error message from SP Help Index, but we get back the result. So we can see here now that the token of demonstrate user was still present when we entered SP Help Index. But now for the really interesting thing, look here in inner SP. There are only 3 rows. Same here for the trigger. There are only 3 rows. So when we entered these guys, these user-written modules, demonstrate user was removed and no longer present in this user token. This is quite neat. Assuming, for example, that inner_sp is actually making an explicit permission check to see whether test user can do something. And it's not going to be fooled because the caller was signed by the certificate. It will still yield the same result. If you want the certificate to be present here as well, you need to sign inner_sp as well. And there's a second thing. Let's say that you as a DBA, you review the code of test SP. You don't have to bother about what inner_sp might be doing. Okay, I can package this permission here, and what inner_sp or what a trigger might do, I don't have to worry, because the certificate will not be present. And I think they made a really good choice. Things you can't sign, like dynamic SQL or system procedures, yep, the certificate is still there, but user-written code, you have the choice, so they remove it. There were some really sharp guys in the SQL 2005 release that work with security in SQL Server. So I'm going to drop the trigger now before I leave this demo and move on. So first of all, to summarize what we have seen. So yes, we must sign the procedure after each change. And you might be thinking, yeah, okay, it's nice in theory, but look, that is just too much work. That is, don't worry. I will show you just in a second how we're going to deal with that. And as I said, now the token and thus the permissions of the certificate user is carried on into dynamic SQL and system procedures. But they are not carried on onto nested procedures or triggers or functions. And this user-written code you can sign yourself. And also remember here that deny always trumps grant, so that deny is the one thing you can't fix with certificates. Now, yeah, that was a lot of work to keep track of all these. Maybe all these passwords, how can I deal with this? So, of course, you're going to automate it, and I've done this for you. I got this procedure called grant perms to SP. So, and it takes 2 parameters, the name of the procedure to sign and a table of value parameters with the permissions you want to package with the procedure. So it will implement the recipe, create the certificate with a name formed from the SP name, from the name of the procedure, so you can tell where the certificate comes from. And then the password, that's a GUID, a random GUID, because we only need it in one place. And the subject, that's the permissions to be granted. And then the sign is the procedure with the certificate, creates a user from the certificate, or again with the name formed from the name of the procedure, so you can easily see what that user comes from, and then grants the certificate user the permissions in the TVP. And when you rerun grant perms to SP, well, then it will see, okay, there is already a signature by this name of the certificate and this user. And it will drop everything and then start over. And that is why you don't need to know the password. You only need it once. It's a throwaway password. You never see it, and you don't need to see it. So here's an example call. I need to declare my table variable, and I need to have a table type. I insert here, for example, select on perm table, and I call test_sp my parameters, and there is a third parameter at debug, so you can see what commands that are generated. And when you try this the first couple of times, I absolutely recommend that you use this parameter. And I would suggest that in many cases, you would put the calls like this in your deployment scripts. So if you have this, the procedure needs to run some dynamic SQL, well, then you would put this at the end to have the select on the tables involved, or something else. All providing, of course, that you permit the developers to do these choices, but if you as a DBA prefer to, and you have junior developers, you wanted to review the code and sign them yourself, yes, you can do that as well. A very important principle I like to stress, and that is you should always identify the minimum permissions you need to package with the procedure. And that is, to be honest, maybe the most difficult part of this technique. One, because you can always slap in as, oh, DBA rule, control. That solves everything, but that's not a good thing, particularly not if you have SQL injection holds. But always identify the minimum permissions you need. So let's have a look at this procedure in a while. So I'm going to first change test_sp to have this version with the reset version with truncate table. And then, so here then, I'm going to create the procedure. And now, this is slightly different from on the slide, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to put this in a separate schema called management. My thinking is this, that in many cases, it's a very good idea to grant users execute permissions on the DBO schema, because granting by every procedure is just, well, a lot of work. So, but they should not be able to run this procedure. Not that they could really do anything with it, because you need permissions to run it. But nevertheless, I put it aside in a schema called management, and then I also create my table type in this schema. And then comes the procedure itself. It takes the name of the procedure, the permissions, and also the debug parameter. I will not go through the code or the procedure, because that's mainly an exercise in dynamic SQL. Very interesting for a talk for dynamic SQL, but for this section, and you absolutely recommend you're welcome to download the script and have a look at it. But for now, I will just page through it and just create it, and only look at what it produces. So. And okay, we need to assign this so test user can run test_sp. This is the one that clears the table, so I guess it needs delete permissions on it. Let's try that. Yeah, and now we can see the commands. So you can see here, create certificate test_sp $cert. So that's the name of the certificate. Now you might be thinking about the dollar. Doesn't mean anything special. Dollar is just another identifier character, just like S or P. Then encryption by password. And this, you can see it's a grid with, well, one extra character at the end, lowercase, to be sure that we pass the complexity check in Windows. And then we have all the permissions, the grant, select delete the perm table, that's the subject, the permissions we grant, add signature to DBO, test_sp, buy certificate, test_sp $cert, and we have this password. Create the user from certificate test_sp, grant delete perm table on test_sp $cert user. And again, you can see the name of the user is formed from the name of the procedure. So, test user now tries to run this and to enter paperback writer. But, cannot find the object perm table because it does not exist, or you do not have. Oh, yeah. Okay, it was not delete. That was alter. Yeah, that's the thing. So, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's great. I actually made that mistake, because now we can see what happens when I rerun. You can see it starts with drop signature for DBO test_sp, buy certificate, test_sp $cert, drop user, drop certificate. And then, no, it does not recreate the certificate. It creates a new certificate. Yes, it has the same name, but it's a new certificate, because what identifies the certificate is the thumbprint, and you will get a new thumbprint every time. And now it says alter my table, and then we have add signature, create user, and grant alter on perm table. So test user makes a second attempt to enter paperback writer and clear the table, and indeed, it's gone. And here we can see test_sp $cert user, which has alter on perm table, and therefore this was possible. So, again, before we move on to server level, maybe we have some questions right now, because this was a little more than a mouthful, maybe.
No, no comments at the moment, but I can see where this is very, very useful. I may have to find ways to put this into production here rather soon. This is cool.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a great technique. I love it. Okay. So this far we was at database level. Let's now try to apply this on server level. And I like to do that by introducing a scenario. So let's say this, you have a multi-application instance. Lots of different applications share this instance. And for each of these databases, or most of them, there are power users who are DB owner in their databases, but they do not have any server permissions, nor should they have. However, these users have a legit need to see which users that are connected to their database. Maybe they want to say, oh, there's no one connected right now. Oh, good, then I can do some maintenance, for example. But to able to see users, you need to use the view DMX accessions, which requires a view server state to see anything else than your current session. However, if you would grant these guys view server state, they could see any user, and that is not permissible. Let's just say this is a hosting service. So the users are from different customers. A complete no-no that they would know anything about other customers. Certificates to the rescue. So let's first look at this, solving this by putting the whole thing in the master database. In this case, the recipe is very similar to before. We create a certificate now in the master. We sign the procedure with the certificate. We create a login from that certificate and grant the login the required permissions, because we are working with server level permissions, and you grant these to server principals, or login as they are called. But while it's called a login, it's not a login that can log in. Yes, it exists only to connect permissions and certificate. And this time to look at tokens, we should look in sys.login token. So let's have a look at this. So I'm going to move to master, and I'm going to create a role called super users, a server role for these power users. And they're going to create a power user for perm test called perm test super with the password of yesterday. And they're going to make him a member of super users. Now, next thing I will do is I will create a login token info, again, the diagnostic view, the same thing as before, except now I'm getting data from syslogin token. And next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a procedure called sp_show users in DB. Now, because it's called sp_something and exists in master, this means I can start this procedure for any database, and then it will execute in the context of that database it was started from. Yes, this is your own system procedure. But beware, this is undocumented, this is unsupported, and could break in any release, and particularly Microsoft could, in next release, all of a sudden ship their own SPShow users in DB that is in the resource database, and which will take procedures over this one. But let's do this for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return the information in the login token info. Then I'm going to check, does this user have the permission to do this? So is this a member of super users, or does the user have the permission controlled server, which is, well, the permission is just the level below sysadmin. And in that case, select star from sys.dmx accessions where database ID equals DBID, the current database. Or else I will just raise an error saying, no, you don't have any business here. Now you might say to yourself, isn't this a little odd? Why doing the permission check inside the procedure? Wouldn't it be better just to grant permissions on the procedure to the users that should do this? Yeah, but the problem is this. When you grant permissions to runs to procedures, you grant that to database users. Or database principals. And which database principals do you have in master? Do you create users for all the users in master? No, there is only one. Public. So everyone should be able to run this procedure. And that's why we need the permission check. So let's now move over to perm test, and I'm going to first run this as myself as a proof of concept. And you can see, oh, first of all, you can see my tokens here. Oh, you can see I got lots of tokens. I collect tokens. I love tokens, yes. If you are a Windows user, you get a lot more tokens than you are in SQL. Anyway, you can see here it returns 4 sessions. But if you look here in my tab strip, you can see I got 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this one to the left is in master. It's not in perm test. So it only returns the sessions connected to perm test. Now, also before I move on, I'm going to create a user for perm test user, super, and I'm going to make him a member of DB owner because, well, he's a super user, so he should be DB owner. And now I'm going to play perm super and run SQL Server users in DB. Note here now, I've changed the command to execute as login. There's two commands, execute as user and execute as login. And really, you should use execute as login as long as there is a login. But the reason I used execute as user in the previous demo is that it's very handy to set up user without login. But if you're really going to try some of your users out there, just use execute as login, because execute as user, as we'll see later, comes with some restrictions, so you can avoid these. They're perfectly fine as long as you're inside the database. But now we're going to do things outside the database. We must use execute as a login. And you can see here that, well, he only gets back the current session. That's all he gets back. And you can also see that login tokens, perm to super, public, and it's also a member of super users. SQL login, server roles, and grant or deny. Okay, let's now sign the whole thing. Return back to master. I'm going to create a certificate called Demon Server Cert with the password while my guitar gently weeps of the subject for the signing of the procedure SQL Server users in DB. Then I'm going to assign this procedure, add signature to SQL Server users in DB by certificate Demon Server Cert with password while my guitar gently weeps. I'm going to create a login for this guy. Create login, Demon Server Cert login from certificate Demon Server Cert. And just like before, I didn't say this, but if I try to create a second login, I get an error message. You can't do that. And now let's look at this login before we move on. I have it here on top, and it's C certificate map login. There is no authentication type desk, but you will have to trust me, you can't log in as this guy, nor can you impersonate it. It only exists to connect certificate and permission. And finally, I'm going to grant this login view server state. So, moving back to perm test, running, again impersonating perm test super, and look, he can now see all the sessions. And we look in login token info, we can see that two more rows, Demon Server Cert login map to certificate, and also a row for the certificate itself. Why the certificate appears here, but it does not appear as a sysuser token, I don't know, and nor do I can see what meaning it has, because the permission comes here. But so this is the important thing. All right, this was so far when the procedure was in the master. But in many cases, you want to do this with the permission in the user database. Now the things get a little more complicated. So the recipe has a few more steps. We start in the user database by creating the certificate and signing the procedure. Then we drop the private key. Because let's say that the local power user was eavesdropping, looking over our shoulder. Ah, that's the password. Great. I will use that. But once the private key is gone, there's no use for the password anymore. There is no private key to use the password for. Because once the procedure has been signed, we don't need the private key. Because for the validation, we only need the public key. Then we copy the certificate, that is the public key, to master, and then create the login from the certificate and grant the login the required permissions. So let's have a look at that. So we're going to move to perm test. I'm again going to create this login token info in this database as well, just to have it available. And then here we have show sessions, which is the same procedure as before, but we had to open a support case, and CSS found out a procedure and told us in no uncertain terms, look, unsupported, don't do that. So we decided to obey and be nice guys, and okay, we're going to move this and have this in every user database, but we retain the permission check for some reason. So it's still there. And perm to super tries to run show sessions. But of course, we haven't signed it yet, so he only sees his own session. Okay, so let's do this. I create a new certificate called Demon Server Cert 2 with the password tomorrow never knows for the signing of perm test DBO show sessions. Creating that guy, add signature to show sessions by certificate Demon Server Cert 2 with password tomorrow never knows. And then all the certificate Demon Server Cert 2 remove private key. So if perm to super seem to remember, oh yeah, that was the last song on Revolver. Just forget about it. It doesn't matter. Now we need to copy the public key to master. So basically we need to do this. We can get the public key into a blob variable, and using the function certEncoded, which accepts the ID of the certificate, which we can get with the function certID. Then we move over to master, and we can use this form of create certificate, daemon server cert2 from binary equals public key. And because there is no private key, we don't need any password. So let's run this. But there is a snag, incorrect syntax in there, public key. You see, this command does not accept a variable. You really have to spell out the signature yourself. Yes, that's right. If you wonder why, the only reasonable excuse I can come out is that they were very, very short on time and simply did not have the time to implement the support for variables. So anyway, there is dynamic SQL. So I need to do this, declare public key and the SQL variable, and then I say create certificate, or rather assign SQL, create certificate from binary, convert varchar max with style type 1. If I say 0, it will interpret it as a string that each pair of bytes denotes a character. And if I say 2, I will get a binary string without 0x, but here I want 0x in front of it. Here's also print. I always like to have a debug print when I work with dynamic SQL. And then I move to master and run that dynamic SQL. So let's do this. And you can see the command create certificate from daemon server cert from binary. And yes, this was all the thing you were supposed to type on your own. Yes. Oh well. And finally, then create login daemon server cert to login from certificate daemon server cert to grant view server state to daemon server cert to login. Let's do this. And now move over to perm test, and perm test super tries to run show sessions. And yes, he can do this. And now again, we have 5 tokens in syslogin token. So this script now continues with the part I'm not going to do, but if you would still be in SQL 2005 or 2008, you will be interested in the second part of this demo, because this part here, this was introduced in SQL 2012, but there's an alternative way to copy the certificate that is shown here, but I'm not going to do it here because these versions are out of support and you should really upgrade if you're still there. Now, you might guess that this also could be automated. Indeed, I do have something for you. I have a script to automate this. Yes, it's a script, not just a procedure. Because I'm thinking this, as a DBA, well, you might want to run the script on, well, this server on Monday, that server on Wednesday, on Friday, it's that server over there. So it's much easier to have this on disk and then open it on the server where you need it, on the instance where you need it in Management Studio. But if you want to make it just a procedure, we can do that. Anyway, you need to specify the database, the procedure, and the permissions. And then the script will create a certificate and use the database, sign the procedure and drop the private key, copy the certificate to master, and create a login from the certificate and grants permissions. There's one more thing though. Let's say that the database is an availability group. Now we need to have the certificate, the login, and the permissions on all nodes in the AG, because else the thing would stop working if there is a failover. So the script does this by setting up a temporary linked server for each node in the AG. So let's have a look at this script, or at least the beginning of it. So here is the database name. I set up the procedure name, DBA show sessions, and here again, a table value parameter with the permissions. And then also a debug parameter, so you can see the output. And then the rest, again, is a long piece of dynamic SQL that I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to run this so you can see the commands. And this is a little more complicated since there are multiple databases involved. It always prints out in which database the commands runs. So the first thing is to check, is there already a signature on the procedure by the convention that we use. And you can see here that the convention I use for the name is completely different from the one that I use for the database. Partly due to because I wrote this script a couple of years earlier, partly also because it's a great thing so they don't collide. So it's signed, and then the full name of the procedure with database and everything. And then I also check if there is a user tied to it. There shouldn't be, but if I need to check so I can really drop the certificate. And then here I can start over in perm test, create the certificate, show sessions, encryption my password in the database. Again, alt add signature, remove the private key, then in perm test get the public key, and in master then sign the thing I got here, and also then create the login and grant the permissions. You don't see the AG part here because I don't have an AG available, so you will You will have to try that yourself. And we can also have a look here and see certificates and see user principles. We type C, so you can see these guys here. These ones here, these are things that comes with the product. But DBA Server Cert, yeah, this was one I created manually, and here's the one that was created for this purpose. And you can see also grant view server states. So you can clearly see that why do I have this procedure? It relates to this. Sorry, whenever I have this certificate, it relates to this database, this procedure, and this is the permission. And there is no private key. And the same thing here, you can also see the login. See, okay, this is a login exists for this procedure. So, before we leave this, I like to just what I think is the beauty of the whole thing. So, let's say you are the server level DBA and you have these local power users. They can be, well, developers, whatever, people that only have, they have DB owner access in the database, but they should do nothing on server. But they need to do something on server level. So you can request to review their code before you sign it, giving the code your blessing that it's okay to run. Okay, yeah, it does. This is okay. You don't overstep in what we agreed on. That's great. Now, if the power user gets the idea to go back to his desk, oh, I'm going to change this procedure, it's going to do this instead because I'm naughty. Well, the permissions will go away and the signature will go away. So it needs to come back to you, and you can just request to review it again. Of course, you might think, well, this is an administrative burden. As a DBA, I don't have the time to do that. Yes, security is an administrative burden. It is a pain in the rear parts. That is just the way things are. But it's an even bigger pain in the rear parts when there is, someone does something really malicious. So, anyway, this means that the power users cannot use this to elevate the permissions behind your back. This is, I think, fantastic. You as a DBA are in full control. And also, I like to point out this. What you see is what you sign. You might see that, okay, this procedure is calling some other procedure, which inserting rows into a table. But you don't have to worry about what that trigger or what that procedure might be doing. Because they will not run with the elevated permissions you package with the procedure. Because the token of the certificate login will be removed when they enter that code. So, before we leave the certificates, do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, we actually do have one.
Good.
Sorry. Will the all this stuff that you're showing actually work on Azure SQL Pass or managed instance?
Let's see here now. Yes. Let me put it this way. I haven't tested it. I don't. This first of all, the server level thing is not going to work on Azure SQL database because you can't do it. You're logged into the database. On and managed instance, I haven't tested it because I don't even have access to managed instance. They cost more than what my Visual Studio allowance will allow me. But yes, it should work. I mean, it's the same thing. So if they would break, I would be very, very surprised.
Awesome. Okay. Yep. That's the question we have.
Yep. Okay. So I'm now going to talk about execute as and DB permissions. And this is, well, it's kind of more popular. I see it more in the wild. And it's an alternate way to do the same thing, but in my opinion, inferior. Anyway, there is a proper version of using execute as. You first start with creating a proxy user without login with the name derived from the procedure. So the same idea as we had with the certificates before. Then you grant that proxy user the required permissions. Again, identify the minimum permissions. And then you add this clause with execute as the name of proxy to your procedure. And then you would do all of this in the same script. You would put these two steps before you have do these two steps, say go and then create procedure in your deployment script. That's not in the options here because the user must exist before you create the procedure. There is also a lazy version. And that is just one single step. You just add with execute as owner and no proxy user. So it's simple as that. Well, let's have a look at this. So I'm going to move to perm test. I'm going to create a new procedure, I'm going to create a procedure called test block, but it's the same thing as before. I'm just giving it a new name. And this is the version with the dynamic part and the SQL injection hole. And rock and roll will get permission to run test block. So just as a reminder, how it works right now, test user is going to run test block and run add Norwegian wood. And we get the select permission was denied on the RB perm table database perm test. But Norwegian wood was inserted, everything that fails is the dynamic part. This is one that fails because test user has no permissions on perm table. So let's now do this with execute as. So I will create a user called testproc.proxy without login and grant select on perm table to testproc.proxy. And then I'm going to change procedure, adding this line with execute as testproc.proxy. And test user now going to run this to enter back in the USSR. And indeed, no error message, but we got back this line. But look here, things have changed. Back in the USSR was not entered by test user. It was entered by testproc.proxy. And if we look in the token, test user is not there. There are only two of them, testproc.proxy and public, grant or deny. And look at system user, well, that's only a SID. And DB user is testproc.proxy. Because this case with execute as, this is not like certificates that you just add a token. No. We are John Malkovich. So let's now look a little more how this works. So I'm going to add this trigger again, and I'm going to do this version with SP help index and exec ingress P, so we can see how far this proxy user remains in the procedure, or remains in the token, or remains in false. So test user runs this to enter drive my account, and indeed, SP help index works. We don't. So apparently testproc.proxy is still in false there. And look here in ingress P in the trigger. We are still testproc.proxy. It does not revert back to test user. And this can be quite devilish. Let's say that this perm table, this trigger, is doing some auditing based on, well, let's say system user, which is very, very common. Now, we do this thing with someone finds the idea, oh, execute as owner, execute as user. I'm going to use that because this is going to solve my problem. And all of a sudden, the trigger's going to audit a system user. We have no interest. Who was this really? You have no idea. Well, of course, if you audit this column, you will find it was me, but that's another story. But as I said, system user is very common. Or let's say this. We're going to go back. Well, we're going to go back to this if you have row level security in a while. But anyway, right, my car was entered. Oops, press the wrong tab there. So this is quite different. And here we have, well, the lazy version with execute as owner. Let's do this with the reset version. And test user tries to run this and then tries to enter with a little help from my friends. And indeed, with a little help from his friends, DBO, he was again able to clear the table. I'll look here now at the tokens. DBO, public, DB owner. And system user now returns SA, DB user, DBO. So let's think about this. For example, let's say that we have this ingress P with execute as owner. And let's see that this ingress P is doing some row level security. And maybe that row level security is set up so that DBO can see anything. All of a sudden, the user sees everything. Anything is gone because someone who's called that procedure slapped on execute as owner without understanding what it means. Big disaster, big bug, and, well, if this is, let's say, the multi-tenant system, you're out of business. If tenancies just have this data, for example. And if we take this dynamic part, now let's say we slap on execute as owner here. Well, now this SQL injection is not matter. I've discussed only the possibility with ownership chaining. The evil test user could say hyphen, not hyphen, but single quote, delete big table. Now we can say drop table big table because his DB owner can do anything in the database. So that's really serious. Before we leave this, I got to select here at the end. It's quite easy if we want to find the procedure that has execute as, because we can see this in SQL modules, which has a column called execute as principal ID. So we can just translate that one with the username, or if it's -2, that means owner. So we can see here now that test block has with execute as owner. So yes, execute as is a lot simpler than certificates. You just put this on and you're done. But first of all, the lazy version breaks the principle of granting minimum permissions. That's just kind of bad that it's just so easy to do and ignoring. And I mean, if there's one thing that people hate is to find out the minimum permissions, because security is just pain in the rear pants for most people. Yes. But more importantly, it breaks the scheme for row level security and auditing based on system use, etc. which is very, very commonly used. However, these are certainly not showstoppers because there are alternatives. We have seen original login. We can use that. There is also session context that, well, I'm not going to talk a lot about here, but you can look at that yourself. There's also an alternative to package or convey who is the real user. So that's not a showstopper. However, it requires that you plan ahead, that you prepare your database to be able to use execute as. So something that seemed simple all of a sudden requires precautions. Now, you might be sitting in front of your computer and get really nervous. Wait a minute, we are using system user all over the place. What if one of our developers start to use execute as? That could bring us into big problems. Okay, I got a DDL trigger down here. I'm going to have a look at it. That just create trigger, stop execute as on database for create procedure, alter function, create trigger, alter trigger. And then gets the data from the event data function. First find out what is the object ID, because it could be, or rather, this is a check, are we able to see the object ourselves? Because it's actually possible to create an object that you don't have access to. But if not, we're going to see, do we have an execute as principal clause on ID? And if there is, yep, we're going to say screen blue murder and say, no, don't do that. So just for fun, I'm going to create that trigger. And then I'm going to try to create one version with execute as owner. And I'm told in no uncertain terms, no, don't do that. That's not allowed. So let's drop the trigger. Now, despite all I've said, you might say to yourself, but execute as is so much simpler, and I don't care about row level security. That's for webs. We don't do that in that system. So I want to use this on server level as well. And you say to yourself, I mean, that can't be very difficult. I create a proxy login. I could disable it. I grant the permissions, add execute as clause. That's very simple, isn't it? Let's do that. Let's try that. So, I'm going to move to master. I'm going to create a login called show sessions 2.proxy with the password magically mystery, and I'm going to disable it and grant it view server state. Because this is only a proxy login, it should not be able, that's only going to exist for the permissions. So I'm going to, that's why I disable it. And then I'm going to move to perm test to create a user for this guy. And then I'm going to create a procedure show sessions 2 with execute as show sessions 2.proxy. Get the login token info, and then, the permission check. Now it's getting a little complicated. Because if I only check is server role member, well, that is directly, that is this guy is a member of super users. Now I can do execute as caller to revert back to the caller's context to pick up, is this a DBA or member of super users, and then do as before, or else give the error message. So you can already see here that execute as actually make things more complicated. Anyway, I'm going to try to run this myself first just to see that it works. And what? I only see my own sessions, and I'm sysadmin. What's going on? Well, look at the tokens here. Now. Token name shows sessions 2.proxy public SQL against server deny only. All of a sudden, these tokens are only good for deny. They're not good for grant. So what is this? Well, when you put in execute as in the procedure, that is the same thing as doing execute as user. And when you impersonate a database user, you are sandboxed into the current database and cannot access things outside of it unless two doors are open for you. The first the door is that the database should be set trustworthy. That opens the door out of the sandbox. But then the door needs to be open to where you want to go. And on server level, that is the permission authenticate server. That should have been granted to the database owner, not you, but the database owner. But you might recall that perm test is owned by SA, and of course SA has authenticate server. So let's move over here and make the database trustworthy and move to perm test. I can run show sessions 2 myself first, and now I see all sessions that are connected to perm test, and now it says grant or deny, and there is a third token in the line, SA, who acts as an authenticator. He's the guy that vouches for the other two. Yeah, okay, they can. I know where these guys are. And perm test human also tries to run this. Same thing. He can see all the sessions. So isn't this fantastic? You might say to yourself, I'm going to use this. This is a lot easier than the certificates. That's trustworthy. Is a security risk. First of all, keep this in mind. When you use certificates, the DBA can request to review the code every time the power user wants to change the procedure with server level access. But if you create a proxy login and execute as trustworthy, then give the power user can't branch to change the procedure to do anything. So as soon as it comes back to the desk, it goes back to his desk, the power user now is going to remove that check on the current database. He's just going to or remove the filter on the DBID and see all sessions on the server or anything else that requires use server state, because he can do that. But that's not all. Red alert. Red alert. So for this script, I'm not going to do execute as login. I will actually log in directly as permtest so you can see what's going on. Sorry, permtest super with the password of yesterday. It's already pre-filled in for me. So permtest super logs in, and we look at the tokens. And also, is he a member of sysadmin? No, he's not a member of sysadmin. We have permtest super, public and super user, and now all of these three in here return permtest super because that was actually the user that logged in. But permtest super, he can do execute as user, DBO. Because, he is DB owner, so he can do that. So what happens now? Uh-oh! Sysadmin. Token name, SA, public, sysadmin. And system user, SA, DBO, he's still permtest super, but if auditing is done by system user, it's going to be, the blame is going to be given to SA, not permtest super. And yes, as SA is now as well again an authenticator, and therefore the other ones gets grant or deny, and not only deny only. And just to show you it's not a joke, he can do SB configure. See, he is really sysadmin. And we're going to revert from being that. So let's see if we can fix this. Remember what I said, that it's not good practice to have SA as the database owner. Here is my take on it. I think the database owner should be an SQL login that exists only to own that particular database, and which should be granted no permissions whatsoever. The database owner should never be a Windows login unless you have, you put these, most of all, it should not be a login that it's tied to a person, I should say. Because if it's tied to, let's say an A login of a person, and that person leaves the company, you get in trouble. You could have an A login that exists only to own the database, but you probably don't want to go there. So I'm going to create this login, and just because I don't want this know the password, I'm just going to create a random grid, and then I'm also going to disable it. And I'm going to make that permtest or owner the owner of permtest. And let's now again log in as permtest super. And now he tries to remove it. Again, tries to play the DBO stunt. Oops. He is not sysadmin, and it says deny only. Permtest or owner appears as authenticated because that's a database owner, but he has not been granted any permissions. So far, so good. But however, when he permtest super runs show session 2, he only sees his own session. So, as I said, if the database owner has been granted authenticate server, the other door will be open. So let's just try that. Although I said that we shouldn't grant any permissions to permtest or owner, but we're just going to play with this and see what happens. And we're going to move back again as permtest super. And now he moves there, runs show sessions 2, and bingo! He sees all the sessions. He sees all the sessions, grant or deny, because now permtest or owner is authenticator and have the permissions to authenticate these guys. Great. And let's see how again permtest super tries to be DBO. And he is not sysadmin. He is permtest or owner. It seems that we have tightened this security hell. That's a great solution. We have, wait, what is going on here? He's creating a user for me in his database. Why? And then he's impersonating me. Yeah, that's it. You can't have the cake and eat it. So, when you combine trustworthy with the permissions authenticated server, a person with DBA owner rights, or actually more specifically, rights to create and the person it uses, can elevate to sysadmin. Very simple. So this is something you should be very, very careful with. So, this is my recommendation. The owner of each database should be unique SQL again, which exists solely to own that database. My thinking about this is that, well, if someone tells you, oh, we need to make the database trustworthy, you might be in a hurry. Yeah, trustworthy, that sounds so innocent. It's just, yeah, I trust that database. Yeah, I can do that. But then if you realize that, oh, I need to grant the permission as well, I like to believe that even a DBA in a hurry will, wait a minute, permission. What is that all about? I need to check this out. So then you might think twice before you do that. But I like to point out, though, that having said this, there are very many services in this world where everyone, or databases in this world, where everyone who is DBA will have elevated permissions in that database. They are already sysadmin because there is no local power user. The DBA, the server level DBAs, have both duties on database and on server. It is in these cases where you have separation of duties where this matters. So if you have such a server, yes, trustworthy is not such a big deal if you are sure that things never will change. I mean, maybe you bring in a consultant to do performance tuning who you want, like, well, we can give him all the trace and view server state, but he should not be able to create logins, etc. And he will probably be DB owner of the database as well, so he can mess around with indexes, etc. So, yeah, still think twice before you make things trustworthy. So, before I go to the last part, I'd like to know, questions?
Yeah, Linda just threw one out there. I'm not sure if this has to do with your questions. But she created a stored procedure and can run it manually, but SQL Server agent job can't find it. Is there a way to fix the issue that you know of?
Not sure I can. Let's see. Maybe we should take that one at the end, so I can also read the question directly from the chat.
Okay.
Because it didn't sound like it related to exactly what we was talking about here.
All right, and that's the only question we have?
Yeah, and there is not. We are getting towards the end. I'm just going to like to cover cross-database access, and this is going to be very, very quickly. It's 2 slides because this, well, because the topic is just. I mean, I can almost talk for 45 minutes or 60 minutes about this alone. So, of course. So anyway, we have a database A, and in this database we have a procedure P that accesses a table T in database B. Now, by default, there is no ownership chaining across databases. So this means if you do nothing at all, there will be a permission error. So how to solve this? Well, this is kind of difficult to discuss because there are many different reasons why we have cross-database access. So depending on the scenario, the best solutions may be, well, there may be different good solutions that you may prefer. But I will quickly discuss the 4 main alternatives. One is just to raise the white flag and, okay, I'm going to add the users to B and I'm going to grant them permissions on T. And sometimes this is the easy way out and sometimes okay, but of course not always. Then you can enable cross-database chaining you need to do that for both databases. And now if the databases have the same owner, well, everything will be owned by DBO and it will work. Or if you can also have, if you have different owners, but then you will need to tweak with that database ownership inside the databases. However, first of all, you need to know that the users, you must still add them to B, that you don't get around with that. But also, much more important, this has exactly the same security problem as making the database trustworthy. That is, anyone who's DB owner or have elevated permissions can elevate to sysadmin. This is it's more cumbersome to exploit. You need a few more steps. You need to create jobs, but it's not going to stop a malicious user who really want to be sysadmin. So, again, this is only really an option on a server where everyone, well, there are only server level DBAs and no database power users. Then you have certificate signing. And I would say this is the perfect choice when you have occasional calls between different applications. Let's say the HR database needs to access the payroll database in 2 places or vice versa. So the way you do is this. You create a certificate in B, you create the user and grant the permissions on T, then you copy to A and sign P. So this is similar to what we did at the master, although I described the steps here in maybe slightly different order. I don't have a script for you to do this, and I discussed this in my article a little more detail. There are some more things here, but let's say the databases are owned by different owners who don't trust each other. This can make things a little more complicated. But apart from that, this is easy to do. And one thing which is very nice with this is you don't need to add the users to B. So the HR users do not need to be users in payroll, because that permission also comes with the certificate. And this is great for the occasional calls, but let's say you have a multi-database applications where there's calls all over the place between the databases. Well, then we have execute as plus trustworthy. And you may be surprised that I'm suggesting this, but I would say this is a better alternative than enabling cross-database chaining if done right. First of all, the database, in this case, if it's a multi-database applications, it makes sense they have the same owner. It should be the same SQL login that has no server-level permissions and absolutely not authenticate server. Absolutely not. But then, yes, if they are the same. And also, the same set of people must be DBA owner in all databases. So if it's a multi-database application because of separating of security boundaries, so it's different people administering the databases, no, because then you will have elevation, exactly the same problem on server level. But so if this is not fulfilled, you have to go for certificates. But because I'm thinking if you have all these cross calls all over the place, even if you can put this in your deployment script, it's to get a little out of hand to having certificates all over the place. And my article discusses these scenarios in a lot more detail, gives you scripts and examples of how to do this. So before I draw this to an end, I just make a quick recap. So ownership chaining, that is what you use 95% of the time for plain and simple DML install procedures. But it does not work with dynamic SQL, it does not work with advanced permissions, it does not work with metadata, and it does not work with server-level permissions, and is disabled by default for cross-database access. Then we have certificate signing, which permits you to package about any database or server permissions in a procedure in a fine-grained way, but you cannot overcome an explicit denial. It's very easy to manage with grant perms to SP and the script for server-level permissions, and for the things I haven't shown you, like cross-database access, you can easily clone them for your own needs. So it's quite easy to work with, although it seems like a burden when you see it from the beginning. And this is the preferred method to do database permissions, and always use certificates for server-level permissions. And then we have execute as. Well, it's good for the lazy and casual. I can't deny that. It's simple to use. But it has implications for auditing and row-level security that requires that you plan ahead. I can't say that I like it, but I would say it's okay for database permissions if conditions are relaxed or you need to overcome a deny. For server-level permissions, always use certificate signing, because else you will be doing this thing with trustworthy, which makes me nervous. So it's getting very near the end. My name is Adam Somasko. Here's my email address again, sq.somasko.sc. Slides and script. I will copy this, or no, maybe. Well, I will do that. I'll try to put that in the chat later on, if I do, unless someone else beats me to it. Anyway, you can find the slides and the scripts on this place, somasko.sc/%, and also on our website you can find these. Well, this is the main article. Package permissions, instant procedures, and there's also an appendix where I describe more special applications and some things I haven't talked about. For example, if you need to do this in an activation procedure for service broker, then it takes us to the next level. There are a couple of more complications that I did not go into here. There's also things, for example, if you want to permit users to start a certain job. So there's a couple of examples. And down here, there is a cleanup script. So if you do the demos yourself, you can run this script at the end, and it will drop the database and drop all the logins and certificates, etc., on server level. And before I just close this, I'd like to say, beware of trustworthy. So I'm still welcome to more questions. We have officially 10 minutes left, and if we need to, I can stay around longer. So I'm going to do this, I think, and copy the link, and see here. If let's see if I can figure out where. Of course, not there. Somewhere it should be something with teams. Yes, sorry. So, oops. Okay, it got in with a big font. Anyway, so there is the URL. So, okay, so this was the question. I created SP and cannot run it manually. Can run it manually, but SQL Server you can find it. So maybe it's difficult without knowing the details, but I would guess maybe that agent is not running the whole thing in the right database. That would be my prime guess. Agent runs, unless the default, the agent will run a sysm, so you will certainly have access to the procedure. Then you can specify a proxy user when you run in various ways, and then of course that user may not have access. So that will be the answer for that question. And maybe I should do this as well. Oops. So here's also in the chat the links to the articles. Oh well. So people seem to like it, but I would always hope. It's always fun to get questions. I know that Seko, I don't know if he's in the presentation, but I was contacted by a guy who had a question in this area, and he said he would attend this session, but maybe he didn't make it.
Well, at least you can always watch it later, because there is a recording of it, which will be put out in the next few days.
Yeah. Yeah, so someone is asking, is this being recorded? I need to view this at least 3 times. Yes. Yeah, I should say this. So I wrote the first version of this article way back in 2006. And then, it was quite easy to learn the mechanics of all the commands doing all this. And then I have to look at every time someone asks a question about this. Okay, look at my scripts as they looked in those days. But it took several years before all pennies dropped into place. For example, this thing with Authenticate Server and all the permissions, I realized that trustworthy was not a good thing, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. But then someone asked, he wanted to make the database trustworthy, but he did not want to make SA of the database, and I played around with it, and eventually, this is what is going on. And some of these things, there are some things I just kept silent on. When you have to do this with Service Broker, it's really, as it says, it takes you to the next level. There's I discussed that in the Service Broker chapter, and I know that I discussed this with a guy who was on the security team way back in 2005. And that was the design we arrived at, because it was 10 years later. But eventually, I realized why they've done what they've done. I'm not going to explain this now, but it is discussed in this article. Security is really one of these things. You sort of, it seems safe to you, but you really have to think sort of out of the box to say, wait a minute, here is a hole that could be exploited. And there's yes, someone asked me maybe we can get the demo scripts. Yes. So if you didn't see this, that's one of the someone's got as SE/%, where you can get everything. Okay, here's some. Certificates for CNR. Oh, that's a good question. Let's see here now. If you have a CNR signed to procedure, no, you can't. If you need to do something there, you will need to call a TSQL procedure and sign it, because you can sign the assembly. And the reason you would do that is because you would it's a privileged assembly, but because the CNR itself, when it runs SQL code, it's runs this for the context connection. That would be a new procedure. That's like dynamic SQL. So if you want to do something from a CNR procedure, you would have to write a TSQL procedure that the CNR procedure calls. And if you want to do something inside the CLR itself directly, then you will have to play with these unsafe and external access permissions. And these days, you may know that you should have these CLR trusted, strict CLR security. And by that one, all assemblies are considered unsafe, because the originally there was something called known as CAS, Code Access Security in the CLR, but it stopped being a security boundary with .NET 4, so they can't really rely on that. But you can use certificates or signing to get. If you want to install an unsafe assembly, that's why we can sign the assembly with a certificate or asymmetric key, and then grant that login, for example, unsafe assembly. But the problem is you can't load an unsafe assembly to sign it. That's a small problem, because they bar for it already then at that point. So you will need to have to sign it outside SQL Server first.
All right. Since it looks like there are no more questions coming in, and we are now almost at an hour and a half in, I think we can call this for the day.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure making this presentation for you. And did you see how many we were in the session in total?
Yes, there was 80 at one point.
80. That's great. Yeah, when I looked at the meetup page and said, well, saw a number like 240 something, I thought, no, wait a minute. That would be very many. But 80 is not bad.
Awesome. All right. So